Okay, now we're going. Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to OSHA's Fatal 4 Hazards. This is the topic for our webinar today. We'll be discussing the top 4 hazards that lead to construction worker deaths on construction sites year in, year out, and some of the efforts that OSHA is putting into trying to mitigate these hazards. So on our agenda today, we will discuss OSHA's Fatal 4 Hazards. We will discuss briefly multi-employer worksite and OSHA's enforcement policy. We will discuss real-life Fatal 4 hazards in the workplace. We will do an inspections of real-life jobs and photographs. We will discuss control measures that we can take to reduce the hazards that are associated with construction, and we will review the Fatal 4 at the end. So what are the Fatal 4 hazards? So the construction industry is truly one of the most hazardous industries in the United States. Data from 2016 indicates that the fatality rate for construction workers is nearly 3 times that of all other industries across the United States. And the leading cause of workers that are dying on the job are falls, electrocutions, struck by objects, caught in or caught between. So let's explore these hazards in greater detail. And ultimately, as employers, your duty is to identify these hazards in the workplace and take proactive steps to control or eliminate these hazards and effectively protect your workers. So why are we emphasizing these hazards? Ultimately, we have approximately 63% of all construction worker fatalities occur with these Fatal 4. And statistically, you can see that workers that are on a construction site are at a significantly elevated risk than workers in general industry or other typical industries. We have the most frequently cited OSHA standards here for federal fiscal year 2017. And as you can see, fall hazards are actually a significant portion of the citable non-compliance hazards that are observed in the field by OSHA enforcement officers. So let's see how this ties in with our Fatal 4. I highlighted in bold and in red those that have direct connection to the Fatal 4 hazards associated with construction work or even maintenance work on the general industry side. Looking at fall protection, falls from scaffold or workers being struck by below from materials falling off of scaffoldings or scaffolding that wasn't erected or disassembled correctly, improper use of ladders, training issues or training deficiencies with the workforce, and eye and face hazards, eye protection, which we're using PPE, which is our last line of defense, as well as head protection, aerial lifts, and systems, criteria, and practices that we use to protect our workers from falls. So on a multi-employer work site, it's important to remember that multi-employer work site apply to all workplaces, not just construction sites. OSHA inspections on construction sites are inherently complicated, and in a work site where there's more than one employer performing work, which could be at a general industry site as well, if you have a third-party contractor that's performing some type of specific work for you, each employer's duty and responsibility for protecting workers against our Fatal 4 hazards will fall into one of 4 categories. So the first one is a controlling employer, and this employer is this owner of the location where the work is being performed, and the entity or the organization that typically hires the third parties to do that work. We have a hazard creating employer, which is the employer who's responsible for creating the hazard. The third category that OSHA looks at is the hazard exposing employer. So the workers the employer whose workers are directly exposed to the hazard on the construction site, and a hazard correcting employer, the employer that has the authority and the responsibility for identifying and then correcting that hazard so workers are no longer exposed. So OSHA follows a 2-step process in determining everybody's role on a multi-employer work site when a hazard is observed by enforcement. And this process can be found under the multi-employer citation policy, which is a CPL 2-0.124, where it states more than one employer may be citable for a hazardous condition that violates an OSHA standard. So any employer that exposes one or more of its employees to the hazards created by an unsafe condition may be subject to an actual OSHA citation. So in situations where an employer's own employees are not exposed to a hazard, that employer may be subject to OSHA's coverage if the employer qualifies as a hazard creating employer, or a hazard controlling employer. So OSHA follows a two-step process that you as an employer need to be aware of to determine whether one or more employers may be cited for a hazardous condition on your work site, whether you're a construction site or you're hosting outside contractors performing work at your location. So the first step is to determine whether the employer is a creating, an exposing, a correcting, or a controlling employer. Once OSHA makes that determination, step 2 is you determine whether a citation would be issued. Under step 2, if the employer falls into one of those 4 categories, it has obligations, has duty to respect those OSHA requirements. So step 2 is to determine if the employer's actions were sufficient to meet those obligations, that all due diligence was performed in order to be able to recognize a hazard. All due diligence was performed by the employer in order to evaluate and control that hazard. So by using this analysis, you can determine the role, enforcement uses this to determine the role for each employer at that work site. And with any investigation, the citations that are issued under the multi-employer worksite policy are always unique and based on unique facts and situations specific to that work location. So to review on the multi-employer worksite policy, by applying OSHA's two-step analysis, again, you can find that two-step analysis on OSHA.gov. You can determine the role and enforcement purposes of a given employer. And as an employer, you have a duty to protect and provide a safe and healthy workplace for your employees. And it's important for you to consider your role when you're hosting a third-party contractor on your site, regardless of your industry. So a citation can be issued under the multi-employer policy, but that is, of course, based on it's unique to the situation and the facts associated with that particular work site. And it's important to remember that the multi-employer work site applies to all workplaces and not just a construction site. So let's get into details on the Fatal 4 hazards. So falls occur when workers are working at height, regardless of the nature of work. And whether construction or general industry, falls presents the greatest opportunity for a worker to suffer a serious injury, disabling injury, or even a fatal injury. So being severe enough that the worker is either partially disabled or fully disabled. Any workers are at risk of a fall when they are working at a height of 4 feet or greater. And OSHA does require conventional fall protection in general industry at this trigger height and fall protection at 6 feet under the construction standards. So on average, why this is important, on average, several hundred workers fall to their deaths in construction industry every year. More than 100,000 workers every year are seriously injured as a result of a fall in the workplace. And we can prevent these. There are 3 conventional means of protecting workers from falls. The first is guardrails, the second is safety nets, and the third is use of a personal fall arrest system. On the electrical hazard, this is electrocutions occur when a worker is exposed to a lethal amount of electrical current, and electric shock occurs when that current passes through the body, causing a reflective response or
Are you still frozen? What do you think?
No, I think we're back. Electrical hazards. Electrocution occurs when a worker is being shocked and is exposed to a lethal amount of electrical energy. Shock occurs when current passing through the body can result in a reflective response in thermal burns both to the inside and the outside of the body. So burns are the most common electrical injury, and burns occur from the heat of the current flowing through the body. Arc flash and arc blast is another hazard that NFPA 70E addresses particularly. And this occurs when electrical current leaves its intended design path, traveling phase to phase or phase to ground. Another hazard that's associated with electricity are fires, and these are commonly caused by improper wiring or issues with fixed wiring or improper use of temporary wiring. Lastly, coming in contact with overhead power lines with conducting materials such as scaffolding or ladders, mobile cranes, powered industrial trucks, that can also provide a conductive path to the ground that can seriously kill or injure your workers. So step 1, we need to ensure that our workers are first electrically qualified, particularly those that are going to be working with fixed or temporary wiring. And we want to make sure that we are implementing all potential controls that we can as an employer, including lockout, tagout, and maintaining safe distances from any overhead power lines or any unprotected, uncovered, energized components of an electrical system. Electricity is a deadly hazard and also contributes to significant fatalities in the construction industry. The third that we want to discuss today are struck-by hazards. And when an object or moving equipment or vehicle impacts a worker's body, causing an injury, OSHA classifies this as a struck-by hazard. The difference between this hazard and caught in or caught between, which we'll be discussing next, is the impact alone is the source of injury to the worker. So common construction-related struck-by hazards include flying objects, for example, an errant nail from a gun, penetrating fully through the work surface that a worker is using, or falling objects from overhead, and like for example, a hammer or some other tools or equipment, perhaps a masonry block falling from an unguarded scaffold, and striking the worker below. We also have swinging objects that can strike a worker from material handling equipment such as cranes. Workers can be struck by a swinging load that is not protected with tag lines. They can be struck by the counterbalance of a crane as well. And lastly, being struck by rolling objects such as a motor vehicle or a mobile equipment that's being operated at the particular job site. The last of the fatal four is caught in or caught between. And this is a fourth series hazard that are killing workers on construction sites year in, year out. So workers can be exposed to unguarded machinery or equipment and positioned between a moving object and fixed object and crushed or killed as a result of this situation. So the job hazards employers they need to identify on a construction site or a general industry site include trenching hazards where vertical walls can collapse, crushing workers, where the benching or sloping could slough or slide into the trench, and again, trapping workers and suffocating them. Having workers that are caught between machinery and equipment that's not properly guarded, and caught between moving objects and fixed objects where workers are killed by compression forces. So let's learn in detail about these four hazards that accounted for exactly 64% of all construction fatalities in 2016. So here's a map of Pennsylvania and its border states. And each pin represents a worker that went to work that morning and died on the job as a result of an unprotected, unrecognized, and uncontrolled hazard in the workplace. You can see that this is a continuing issue. This is from January 1st to December 31st, 2017. And you can see that the seriousness of these hazards on the job site and the need for effective hazard recognition, evaluation, and control strategies to try and prevent these workers from being killed. So to review on our fatal four and our introduction to them, in calendar year 2016, 64% of all construction fatalities were caused by just these four hazards: falls, electrocutions, struck by, caught in, or caught between. What often complicates the hazard recognition, evaluation, control is the complexity of a job site, particularly a construction job site where we have a general contractor, and we can have several subcontractors or even several dozen subcontractors performing individual scopes of work. But it also applies to the general industry as well, where you're hiring specialized contractors to come in to perform work such as HVAC on your roof, or ripping up and replacing parking lot, or doing masonry work on the side of a building, for example. This is a map of all construction fatalities across the United States for the same time period in 2017. This is from January 1st to December 31st. And each one of these dots again represents a worker that woke up in the morning, went to work, and did not come home the next day. The causes of death from falls in particular, there are several causes that you need to be aware of as an employer. A worker can be killed operating or working near a non-moving vehicle. Of course, workers can fall to a lower level or fall to the same level. Workers can be performing roofing work in industrial or residential construction and can suffer a fall from a roof. They could be performing structural steel erection. They could be working from scaffolding, erecting or dismantling the scaffolding. Of course, improper use of working from a ladder, and floor docks or other elevations where they're working on the ground and can fall below. So there's two strategies that we implement in protecting workers from fall hazards. First is prevention, and the second is protection. On the prevention side, we are using engineering controls such as guardrails that protect our workers and keep them from approaching the hazard. We also use strategies such as restraint or positioning that keeps a worker from approaching a leading edge or an unprotected edge. We have warning lines that we can also implement at the job site, which can result in a controlled access zone or a controlled decking zone. And these are protected actively by a safety monitor who are trying to alert workers to prevent them from approaching the fall hazard. On the protection side, we have personal fall arrest systems, we have safety nets that can be implemented, and we have catch platforms below. Do controlled access zones and controlled decking zones protect workers or stop workers from falling? No, it is an administrative control that we use in order to try and get workers, to protect workers from approaching the edge and being exposed to the actual hazard itself. On hazard recognition and control, we need to recognize that falls are the leading cause of construction fatalities. And in 2016, OSHA issued nearly 7,000 fall protection citations alone. And again, 64% falls are 1/3 of all construction-related fatalities that occur in the workplace. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, almost 100,000 workers are seriously injured by falls every year. One step that an employer can take to try and protect workers from the hazards associated with these fatal falls is having a competent person on the construction site. And the OSHA definition of a competent person is a person who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in surrounding and working conditions, which is unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to the employer, and has the authority to take prompt corrective measures in order to eliminate them. So having a competent person on site actively evaluating the work site and the changing conditions associated with construction is a really important first step into recognizing these hazards and beginning to take steps to control and eliminate them. Within falls itself, 1/3 of all fatal falls are from roofs. 1/4 of these falls occur from ladders. And everybody that's listening here today, I know you have these types of hazards in your workplace. Everybody has a ladder there that workers are expected to use. So the OSHA standards you need to focus on and to ensure that you protect your workers are 1926 Subpart M, fall protection, Subpart X for ladders, Subpart L for scaffolds, and this applies to both construction and general industry, and of course for steel erection activities at Subpart R. So let's identify several fall hazards that are in the field. The trigger height for workers who are exposed to a hazard, hazardous equipment or materials or hazardous chemicals below, the trigger height is 0. Workers need to be protected from this hazard at all heights, regardless of that height. And typically a guardrail would be the best option to protect workers and prevent them from falling into the hazardous equipment that's located below. Any break in elevation during construction can cause a fall either to the same level or a fall to a lower level. And here we have a picture of a construction site where a masonry block is being used as a temporary step to transition from one elevation to a second elevation. Workers who are traveling back and forth are at risk of stepping in, tripping, falling, and becoming seriously injured as a result of this unsafe condition. Providing safe access to workers who are working on temporary work platforms such as scaffolding is really critical. And the competent person needs to ensure that safe access is provided to this type of equipment. So when workers are using ladders in order to get to the temporary working platform, that first step onto the platform, workers need to be protected all the times. So ensuring that your written plan includes safe access for workers is a critical step in protecting them from falls associated with use of this equipment. Workers who are performing steel reinforcing or building forms for concrete pours are, of course, also at fall risk. And personal fall risk systems provide a tremendous amount of flexibility in order to protect the workers from hazards associated with a specific type of work. Use of double-legged lanyards and retractable lanyards, horizontal lifelines or vertical lifelines are all options that the employer can use to protect workers from falling when they're performing this type of work. When workers are on decking, roofs, transitioning on ramps, they're also exposed to potential falls. And it's not uncommon to go out on the construction site and see ramps that lead workers from one elevation to a second elevation to not be fully and properly protected as it is in this photograph. In this photograph, you can see that we have a top rail and a mid rail on the ramp, and we have top rail and mid rail sections on the leading edges as well. Our scaffold platforms in this picture, actually, we have two workers that are at a serious risk of a fall, and our scaffold platforms here are providing no fall protection for these workers. Implementing a cross bracing with either a top rail or a mid rail, depending on the cross height of the equipment, or providing personal fall arrest systems, vertical lifelines, or even perhaps working and doing some of this positioning work or erecting of this scaffolding from an aerial lift would be prudent to protecting these workers. Occasionally on active construction sites, workers need to reach elevated work surfaces, and they'll do this using vertical fixed ladders. And we need to be able to provide a vertical lifeline with a climbing connector for their personal fall arrest system when workers are going up and down unprotected fixed ladders that do not have cages. We also have steel erection work, which places our connectors and steel erectors at serious risk of falls as well. And there are a lot of engineering solutions that can be implemented pretty easily for fall protection, used for anchor points and connectors with a personal fall arrest system. Workers can use beam connectors, beam straps to connect overhead beams, vertical lifelines, and horizontal lifelines when performing this type of work to protect them from a fall. Falls from portable ladders, of course, can occur regardless of your industry. Workers who are climbing or reaching from a portable ladder are at risk of falling as well and having the ladder kick, twist, turn, slide, or fall beneath them, leading to a seriously disabling or potential fatal injury. So it's important to be able to plan for fall protection, and the best practices dictate that our fall protection or our fall prevention strategies need to be an integral part of our project planning from the very beginning. And implementing prevention through design strategies to ensure that these four hazards in particular never enter our work site. The project can't be truly safe unless fall prevention and fall protection techniques are incorporated in every step and every phase of the construction process. And effective planning, thorough planning by the organization will keep your workers safe and minimize the liability associated with all parties. So we want to protect fall protection systems that are appropriate for the given situation. There's a lot of equipment that's available to workers out there to protect themselves, and we want to make sure that personal fall arrest systems are appropriate for our workers based on their body types, whether they're female or male, they're short or they're tall. Personal fall arrest systems can be tailored to meet the particular situation and the particular worker. We need to supervise our employees properly, ensure that our competent person in fall protection is searching the job for these particular hazards that we discussed today. We're using the correct work procedures. We're training our workers effectively so they properly select, they properly use and maintain their fall protection systems. And that includes routine inspections by the competent person of that equipment to ensure that if a worker does fall and their life depends on this equipment operating correctly, that it will in fact perform the way we intend it to. On electrocution, in 2016, there were 991 construction workers killed on construction sites. Of that, 82 workers were killed as a result of being electrocuted. Common electrical hazards include improper grounding, damaged insulation to the wiring, whether it's temporary or fixed, contacting overhead power lines with conductive materials such as scaffolding members, aluminum ladders, cranes, or powered industrial trucks, not inspecting or using damaged power tools, and not supplying ground fault circuit interrupters on the job site. So we need to protect our workers from coming in contact with unguarded electrical components or circuits. We can do this through a myriad of strategies. We can use personal protective equipment. We're providing rubber insulating gloves and leather protectors. We can dress our workers in arc-rated clothing as well. But essentially with arc-rated clothing, we need to remember that we're telling our worker, like fall protection, that we haven't eliminated this hazard. This hazard still exists, but we're dressing you, providing you with the PPE to ensure that you survive this event. So backing this up and going through the hierarchy of controls and trying to eliminate the hazard is always your best option as an employer. Providing ground fault circuit interrupters for temporary wiring on construction sites or where your maintenance department may be working out in your plant. Having a thorough and effective routine power tool and electrical equipment inspection process, and of course implementing lockout tagout all the time. The OSHA standards that address electrical hazards are Subpart K under 1926, or the construction standards, and 1910 Subpart S under the general industry standards. We also follow 1910-147 lockout tagout, and power generation, transmission, and distribution industry. On the construction side, we follow Subpart B, or 1910-269, to protect our workers in those industries. NFPA also publishes 70E, and this is a standard that employers can adopt in their workplace to protect their workers from the hazards associated with both shock and arc or arc blast hazards. So 70E ensures that workers understand the magnitude of the current that's available, the fault current, that they remain a safe distance, that they're effectively trained, and that they're dressed properly in order to perform the work that's expected of them. So let's take a look at let's take a walk through an active job site and see if we can recognize any electrical hazards in the field. In this case, we have extension cords that are being stored on the ground. We have spliced electrical extension cords that are spliced together improperly, and an effective inspection program would identify these and tag and remove these extension cords from service. In addition to this equipment being stored on the ground, it also creates a slip, trip, and fall hazard for workers who are trying to navigate this construction site. And then you can also see that we have an unprotected hole over here in the top right corner as well, so we also have a fall hazard associated with this photograph. As we do our work in OSHA consultation, we see numerous electrical hazards in the field, and this is just an example of one. In this case, we have unprotected electrical circuits that workers can come in contact. In this case, we have no ground fault circuit interrupter. The green wire or ground wire is not connected. Our system is not effectively grounded, providing power to a power tool on the job site. Workers can reach in and come in contact with the electrical conductors as they are unprotected. There's no cover on these boxes, and the panel boards were not dead fronted. A common piece of equipment used both in general industry and construction. Do you see any hazards associated with this? So again, we have an electrical drill with a flexible cord and a conductor that is damaged, though, where it is spliced together, and our green wire, which is our ground wire, is left unconnected. So the ability for the worker to be protected from coming in contact with electrical current is disrupted, and there is no safe ground path for current to travel back to a safe source. You recognize any hazards associated with these overhead power lines. In this case, we have scaffolding that was being erected along a building front and overhead electrical distribution lines. In this case, it was 7,200 volt power lines. And in this case, scaffolding was erected exactly 4.5 feet from that location. Recognize any hazards associated with our temporary wiring. In this case, we have a plug that's spun around backwards. Our continuous path back to an earth ground is not maintained. And we have multiple cords used in this case for powering fixed equipment. And we have damaged electrical insulation here as well. Typically, this is the result of workers who are pulling on the extension cord to try and unplug it from an outlet, and damages that connection right at the plug. Recognize any hazards associated with this connection. So we have our hot and our neutral pins, but we are missing our ground pin in the equipment. So the employer is operating a stand fan in this case, and have removed the pin to be able to provide power to it for an extension cord that did not have a ground path associated with it. Here's another common electrical hazard that we have, where our temporary wiring is run through a door opening, a wall opening, in this case a door, and then is left unprotected. If this door swings closed, it will come in contact and damage the insulation, energizing both the door and the metal frame around the door. Pinch points need to be protected in order to protect this wiring. It is temporary. It does offer limited protection with the insulation that it's designed with. So steps need to be taken to provide that temporary power from a different location, so the power doesn't need to go through the doorway. Struck by. In 2016, of the 991 construction workers that were killed, 93 of these were killed being struck by an object. So our common hazard here are falling objects from overhead, for example, drop tools or tools being kicked off an unprotected scaffold, temporary work platform, or a permanent work surface overhead. Flying objects where tools become dislodged, or we have errant nails traveling through the workpiece, striking workers working behind. Come in contact with heavy equipment and swinging objects, such as the load that's being lifted and positioned, or the counterbalance on the crane, or rolling or sliding objects. Steps that we can take to protect our workers are ensure, particularly those that are working on highway, around mobile equipment and vehicles, is high visibility personal protective equipment. I think we lost your connection there. Fatal for, struck by. The steps that we can take to protect our workers is providing them high visibility personal protective equipment. So workers are clearly visible in the area where they're at risk of being struck by. Providing barriers or warning signs noting operators' equipment that they're in an area where workers may be exposed to this hazard. Installing tow boards, inspecting rigging, and not standing beneath any suspended load when we're operating material handling equipment. And ensuring that when we park a piece of equipment that we chock the wheels and we engage the parking brakes. So the standards that apply to the struck by hazards, we had 1926 subpart L scaffolding, subpart M fall protection, subpart double C cranes and derricks, subpart E, and subpart I for personal protective equipment under construction, general industry, and lockout tagout. So let's take a walk through an active construction site to see if we can identify any hazards. Is this worker at risk? We could say that this worker is at risk of a struck by hazard because he is working within swing radius of the heavy equipment and the equipment operator adjacent to him as they're doing this trenching and excavation job. In this case, the worker is operating a circular saw. Do we recognize any hazards? So grinding or striking or flying debris coming off of this operation can strike the worker in the face. So this worker is protected by a face shield, but safety glasses, the NCC 87.1 safety glasses or goggles below would be a second step to provide double level of protection from it being struck by an object coming off of that tool. Any hazards associated with this construction job? We have workers below with work going on overhead. Of course, this worker is at risk of falls. But the work that's going on overhead places these workers at risk who are not provided any protection, such as hard hats, from falling objects. Recognize any hazards with this site. We have a couple workers that are out here in the field, and one worker that is guiding this load here, wearing high visibility vest here, and workers that are over here are not. So as this worker is trying to guide this crane load in, the worker is actually at risk of working beneath this material and is at risk of being exposed to falling or swinging struck by hazards. A tagline placed on this device would certainly help be able to position this material and keep this worker away from this particular hazard. This one's a little harder to see, but take a close look at what's going on here. We have a worker here on the mobile crane, and we have an active lift that's going on here. See any hazards associated with this? We have a load that's being picked up and moved and suspended. We can have a worker that's in the swing path of this load. We need to be able to control this load, of course, and taglines would be able to provide that worker the ability to stand away and be clear of this hazard while they protect the equipment and protect the material that we're hoisting and controlling that load from beginning to finish of the job using a tagline. Here we have an operator using a powder actuated tool, and they're going to apply a fastener, and we have a worker that's working on the other side. So when we're using powder actuated tools, they create a flying object and an obvious strike by hazard. So we can't, we need to ensure that before we drive our fasteners into the work pieces, ensure that the work material is of sufficient thickness to prevent that fastener from penetrating the material when we have workers working on the other side. Barriers, tag lines, warning lines can also be used here to keep workers out of the area behind the tools that's being operated. Our caught and caught between hazards. In 2016, of the 991 construction workers that were killed, 72 of those workers were killed as a result of being crushed to death, caught in or caught between more than one object. So these hazards are typically associated with unguarded machinery or rotating equipment, unprotected trenches that can cave in, trapping our workers and suffocating them, pinning or crushing workers through material or equipment that they're using, or being caught beneath collapsing scaffolding. We need to protect our workers from struck by hazards by ensuring that all nip points or in-running points are protected with effective machine guarding, that workers aren't wearing loose hanging clothing, jewelry, tools, or other articles such as long hair or ponytails that become caught in this equipment. That in addition to installing these guards, that there's an inspection process for maintaining these guards to ensure that guards aren't removed, or if they're removed as part of the lockout tagout process, that they're reinstalled before the equipment is started up. We want to make sure that we lower our articulating our boom arms on our equipment when we're powering down and parking them, and provide barriers to protect workers from entering an area where they can become crushed between or pinned between as the equipment rotates or moves. And of course, we follow all the requirements for benching, sloping, or providing trench boxes to protect our workers when they're working in excavations and trenches. Again, we have this competent person. A competent person plays a really important role in ensuring that our workers are effectively protected from routine inspections, including trench and excavation, scaffolding, and fall protections. We can provide spotters. We can provide backup cameras, backup alarms for our equipment operators to ensure that workers don't find themselves in our blind spots as we're rotating or moving or repositioning this equipment. We want to ensure that we have rigorous hazard training for all site workers, including our visitors and our subcontractors and their subs as well. So the standards that you need to be focused on as an employer are ladders, subpart X and subpart D in general industry. Subpart L under construction and general industry for scaffolds, cranes and derricks, personal protective equipment, of course, subpart P for excavations and trenching. So let's take a walk through a couple active construction sites to see if we can determine any struck by or caught between hazards on this location. So here we have a caught-in hazard that can occur when a worker, when the material handling machine can move that. These workers are standing between these two loads. It can become caught between and trapped. Here, do you recognize any hazard associated with this machinery? In this case, we have a belt-driven power takeoff that's unprotected and unguarded. So this belt and pulley system provides an in-running nip point that worker's hand or loose articles of clothing or gloves or ponytail could be caught in and seriously injure the worker. Recognize a hazard here. It seems pretty obvious. Our worker is wearing gloves and other long sleeves or jewelry, and all of these can create a hazard to our worker that can be caught on this rotating equipment when it's unguarded and we're performing, for example, lockout tagout. Here we have a worker that is in a trench below, and we have other workers that are working along this leading edge. You can see any hazards associated with this. Well, there's several. So we're excavating next to a residential structure in this particular case, and there's no protective system provided for this worker in this trench. We have a ladder at the end of the trench that provides the only means of access for this worker in and out of the trench, and they're working in a vertical wall trench and being exposed to engulfment hazards should this wall collapse. And another hazard that is the spoil pile is located clearly within 2 feet of the vertical wall edge here as well. Lots of issues going on in this particular job site. Here we have one pretty obvious hazard as well, and lockout tagout, of course, can prevent this worker from being crushed and killed. So the truck box, we need to do maintenance and hydraulic systems or brakes, for example, or do routine maintenance for this vehicle, and ensuring that the truck box, lift gate, everything is effectively locked out, tagged out through blocking, ensures that this equipment can't move and crush our workers. Here we have a hazard where a worker is standing between a fixed object and a piece of mobile equipment, in this case a track dozer, and of course is at risk of becoming caught between should that piece of equipment suddenly lurch backwards or move, or if the parking brake becomes disengaged and will trap this worker. Here is the ground surface for underneath of the scaffold, where we have workers that try to ensure that this scaffold is level. So we have on our mud sills and base plates, we have a scaffold here that they use masonry block in order to make it level, and screw jack footing can provide the same leveling capability for the equipment and make the scaffolding safer for the workers to use. So in conclusion, we have discussed the fatal 4 hazards that are associated with construction sites. We defined our multi-employer work site. We took a walk through active construction sites, and we were able to identify the fatal 4 hazards in the field and improve our hazard recognition, evaluation, and control skills. We discussed specific control measures that employers can use to reduce risk associated with these hazards. And chat questions that you may have will be addressed in the upcoming week. I wanted to let you know that OSHA is promoting their National Safety Stand Down. This begins May 7th through the 11th of 2018. If you go to OSHA.gov, into the search bar above, you can type in stand down, and all the resources that are available associated with OSHA's outreach efforts to protect workers and decrease the number of workers that are falling year in, year out. You can find all these resources here on OSHA.gov. OSHA's intention is to perform a safety stand down, which is a voluntary event for workers to stop work and have a focused conversation on fall hazards that may occur in their workplace. Anyone can participate in OSHA's stand down as well. In past years, it's been commercial, residential, and commercial construction companies. General industry employers have participated, highway construction companies, trade unions, institutes. Anybody that has a fall hazard can participate in OSHA's event. OSHA also provides guidance on how to conduct an effective safety stand down and how to effectively communicate with your workers about these hazards and what they can do and the employer can do to protect them from being seriously hurt or injured as a result. So just a reminder about our OSHA Consultation Program. This is a great service for Pennsylvania employers, and we often hear when we're in the field that our consultation program is OSHA's best kept secret. And the fact that we get recurring business and have a large backlog really does tell the story about the effectiveness of the program. So the consultation program is designed for small, medium-sized businesses, and the definition of a small business under this consultation program is 250 employees at a single site or 500 workers corporate-wide. They become our first priority when they're high hazard and small employers. Large business requests are honored as well, but due to our available resources, we can only provide limited scope visitation services to the larger employers. So here's the thing about OSHA consultation. We are much different than OSHA enforcement. OSHA consultation does not issue citations or penalties. Your only obligation to use this free resource is that you agree to correct any serious or imminent danger hazards that are identified during the visit process. Failure to correct a hazard does require a referral to OSHA enforcement to ensure that the workers that are exposed to those hazards are protected, but the occurrence of referrals is very rare. So most importantly is this service to you is free of charge. And as a benefit of this, partnering with OSHA Consultation, you avoid any OSHA penalties and litigation costs. As a result of ensuring your compliance improves, your worker compensation costs are reduced, and it minimizes the risk of equipment damage, facility damage, or product losses as well. So if one consultant that performs a walkthrough is able to observe an average of 7 serious or other serious hazards, this actually is a cost savings to you, the employer, of approximately $90,000 in avoided OSHA fines for that visit. This is our contact information. You can reach us at 1-800-382-1241, or you can reach us through our website to enter a request at iup.edu, PA-OSHA consultation. Questions can be provided through the chat window. They'll be answered within the next 7 days and posted on our website. The next upcoming webinar is hexavalent chromium, and that will be held on July 18, 2018 at 10:30 a.m. I want to thank you for your attendance today, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat window.